In this video, we will talk about the context of several of the Pauline epistles. This is part 1 of 2 videos. The first video will cover the texts of Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. As always, we want to start by looking at the authorship and composition date of these texts. Now, since these are Pauline epistles, we might take for granted that Paul wrote the texts. Of course, we've talked about before how some of the texts we see in the New Testament were not actually written by the people who they were attributed to. For example, we talked about the Deutero-Pauline epistles, which were attributed to Paul or written by some of his followers, but probably not actually written by Paul. In this series of Pauline epistles, we have a couple of these. Galatians is a text that more than likely was written by Paul the Apostle, and this is agreed upon by most modern scholars, though there is some variation here. This epistle was probably written between the late 40s and the mid-50s. The text of the Ephesians is one of the ones that is often not considered to be written by Paul. This text was written around the late 50s or later, again depending on whether we actually attribute it to Paul or to one of Paul's followers. Paul dies around the year 65 CE, so a later date is often used for texts like this, if they were written after Paul's death. Ephesians is an interesting text, which we're going to look at in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but this is one that most modern scholars claim that Paul did not actually write. Now Philippians, as you can see here, I have Paul with an exclamation mark. This is one of the texts that almost undoubtedly was actually written by Paul the Apostle. Paul seems to have a close relationship with the church of Philippi, and probably wrote this letter to the church there from prison around the years 59 to 62 CE. The letter to the Colossians is also one that's questioned, though not quite as highly as Ephesians. The dating on this is a bit confusing. If Paul actually wrote it, then we could say that it was probably written around the years 59 to 62 CE, while Paul was in prison. However, if we claim that Paul was not the author of this text, it was probably written after Paul's death. Some of the reasons that people claim that Paul did not actually write some of these texts is based on the wording that's used, such as in Ephesians. We don't see Paul's popular phrases, and the theological ideas. Let's take a look at each of these letters in order as we see them in the New Testament. Galatians was probably written to Galatian churches. In many cases, we see letters that were written to a specific church, but Galatians seems to be written to a group of churches in Galatia. The focus that the author, probably Paul, has here is defending his mission to the Gentiles. As we've talked about previously, Paul was meeting resistance, particularly from Jews who thought that Christianity was only for them. And this resistance was in Paul trying to spread this mission to the Gentiles. Galatians covers this and also explains the quote-unquote false teachings of the Judaizers, or these people who were trying to make Christianity exclusively Jewish. Now, of course, Christianity began as a Jewish movement, but what we see in Paul's letters is a transition from it being simply Jewish to inclusive of all people, Gentile or Jew. The book of Ephesians is a really interesting one. We might take for granted that the book was written to the church in Ephesus. This is and is not the case all at once. The text never indicates that it was written specifically to the church in Ephesus, as those were additions in later manuscripts of this text. Many of the findings of this text do not have "to the church in Ephesus." Most scholars think that this was actually a circular letter. This was something that was distributed to many churches, rather than just the church in Ephesus. The focus of the book of Ephesians is both to encourage Christians to grow in their beliefs, as well as to explain that there is an incorporation of Gentiles into this supposed plan that Paul believes God has for the Jews. So Christianity again becomes a focus on including Gentiles alongside Jews as part of God's plan. Philippians was written most likely to the church at Philippi and has a couple different themes and intentions here. Again, this is probably a letter that Paul wrote himself. And Paul wants to explain why he was sending back Epaphroditus to the church. He also wants to settle differences in the church, but the tone that we see in Philippians is not quite as contentious as we see in some of the other letters, indicating that Paul had a better relationship with his church than some of the other ones. He also thanks the church for the gift that they gave to him. Colossians was more than likely written to Colossae and was arguing against the false teachings that were abounding in the church. And these false teachings primarily had to do with mysticism. The idea that Paul is arguing against here is that Christianity does not necessarily have to include mystic beliefs to be Christianity. Many people were arguing that to actually be a Christian, one had to experience mystical things, and Paul was pushing back against this. The book also encourages Christians to follow a Christian lifestyle, something specific that's not Jewish and not pagan, but something new that incorporates some Jewish tradition, but is also slightly different. As you read through the text of Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, you notice a couple themes pop up, and these are pretty consistent among these texts. The first of these is the strengthening of faith. This is something we see in many of Paul's epistles. Paul writes to the churches that he has founded or has visited or wants to visit to encourage them to strengthen their faith and to follow their Christian belief system. Now, this is not to say that Paul did not think that they had faith or that this is even the utmost priority for the church. But again, these Christians were living in a time where there was actual persecution. People were being persecuted, abused, even killed for their religious beliefs. Because of this, Paul is encouraging the Christians that even in the face of persecution, they should have faith in Jesus and follow their Christian belief system. The other theme that we see throughout these is a focus on false teachings. Now, false teachings can come in many different forms. Paul writes in some of his letters arguing against the false teachings of the Jews who say that Christianity has to be exclusively Jewish, like in Galatians. Back in Corinthians, we saw some focus on pagan false teachings, with people wanting to take part in the Corinthian temple and all that went along with that. And Paul argues back against that. We also see some other false teachings, such as mysticism and Gnosticism, that Paul pushes back against. Now, we use the term false teachings here, not necessarily to claim that these teachings or belief systems are wrong, but in Paul's eyes, what we see in the Pauline Epistles, this is the stance he takes on these. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the letters to the Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. Describe the historical setting and context of the letters to the Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and identify the themes in the letters and give examples of how they are used in the texts.